Welcome back to Blumira Briefings, your weekly download of the top headlines and trends for your security practice. This week, we've got a self-spreading worm slithering its way through the NPM registry, old tax season scams getting an upcycle using AI, and a firewall vendor getting sued because the security tool became a major security problem. Let's get into it. First up, researchers at Socket uncovered sandworm mode, 19 typo-squatting NPM packages that are stealing credentials and actively spreading their infection. Once a developer installs one of these compromised packages, the malware harvests API keys, crypto wallets, and NPM tokens, and then uses those stolen credentials to push infected code back into the victim's own repositories and packages. If last year's Shai-Hulud worm was proof of concept, you can consider this the production release. And it's also injecting rogue MCP servers into AI coding assistants like Claude Code and Cursor. So now that AI pair programmer that you've been working with could also quietly be exfiltrating data. What's the world coming to? Matt, what practical steps should teams take to protect against supply chain attacks weaponizing their own credentials?
When we talk about supply chain attacks like the current NPM worm, the first thing development teams and others need to accept is this. This is not a rare event. It's nothing new. It's happened before, and it's probably going to happen again. The first thing that came to mind when I was reading the article was the 2018 credential theft issue around ESLint. I don't remember it very well, but I do remember some of the pain from the fallout from it. The ecosystem around NPM is built on a few things. First off, it's massive, it's automated, and it's built on trust. Now, all three of those things make it highly efficient, but they also make it highly attractive to attackers. Step one in protecting yourself is reducing your blast radius. Treat NPM install for what it is, remote code execution by design. If your pipeline automatically runs post-install scripts from the internet, that's probably going to be a decision and not a necessity. So disable what it is that you do not need. Next, enforce deterministic builds. Commit your log files, eliminate the dependency drift, and don't have build servers running whatever the latest library is that's, part of your project at 2 o'clock in the morning when things can just completely explode on you. No one needs that. Keep things locked down. Stability leads to security. Now, protect your continuous integration and development workflows like they are production no matter where they happen to live. Use short-lived tokens, use least privilege, and absolutely no long-lived credentials sitting in environment variables where they can be scraped. Don't make it easy for people to get the information that they shouldn't have. Now, for MSPs and different types of IT organizations, these suggestions should be a part of your baseline. If you're managing environments, dependency control and build isolation belong in the same exact conversations as things like managed, endpoint production or MFA. They're just as critical. They may not be exposed in the same manner, they may not be used by the same team members, but they are just as critical to maintaining operations securely. Now, this pattern, and it is a pattern that we're seeing, has nothing to do with sophisticated exploits. It has everything to do with abusing default configurations. If your development pipeline can execute arbitrary code from the public internet without hitting a couple of hiccups or speed bumps for the sake of security, you don't have a secure supply chain. You have one built on convenience. And that level of convenience is exactly what attackers are counting on.
And it's that time of year, the most actuarial time of the year, with tax season in full swing. And where there's high emotive financial smoke, you're going to find scammers firing off phishing email and text campaigns impersonating the IRS. A growing number of these campaigns are now using voice calls as well, as AI-generated voices are making vishing calls harder to spot than ever. Almost as hard as getting me to say vishing, a word that I hate. The playbook ranges from fake refund notifications to bogus W-2 schemes, mostly circulating on social media. The golden rule we learned in school still holds up. The IRS will never hit up your DMs or contact you through email, text, or phone to ask for personal information. We all learned that, right? If they want something, it's going to be coming by mail. Matt, what are the key red flags that people in businesses should watch for to avoid becoming a tax time target?
The amount of change we've seen in business email compromise, particularly around taxation, the IRS, when things are kind of kicking up during tax season, is crazy just in general. One of the things that, at Blumira we look at a lot is what do the attackers look like? What are they doing recently? How have they kind of evolved their attack process? And how does that change from a seasonality perspective? And what we're hearing from the IRS coming into 26, we've seen this every year, is this continuous kind of increase that we see across, managed service providers all the way. It doesn't matter how big you are, because the attackers are looking at this as a, potential to expand, potential to do more. And, when it comes to the scams that are out there, they're not going to change much year over year. We're talking about the usual kind of text messages. I'm sure we've all experienced kind of like the toll text messages, but the similar kind of, there's a return available, you're missing out on money, click this text message and log in and we'll get you what you need. Similarly, on the email side, those kind of risky emails are going to give people the ability to give up their credentials. And in a lot of those cases, what those attackers are trying to do is really lure your users into a place where they can then get into the email and pull that data. And one of the things that's been really interesting for us here at Blumira is we've started to do more research on the activities post-authentication into these environments. So you think about what happens, you think about someone on your finance team, they clicked on an email because they thought it was legitimate, they logged in because they thought they were logging in to get a file, they give up their credentials and they move on with their day. What that attacker is then going to do is authenticate back into your environment and start looking for stuff. And think about how that kind of aligns to tax time when you're talking about the kind of information available, the kind of emails that are getting sent around with the kind of financial details, what's available in SharePoint. What we tend to see in these situations is authentication. I'll come back to how that kind of looks, but authentication in, and then immediately as fast as possible, searching for sensitive files. That could be invoices that have been sent, that could be tax filings that were previously done, that could be anything they can take out of that email. They're going to look at your SharePoint and OneDrive and start sharing as many files out as they can, which is to say we've seen situations where an attacker will land and share 700 files with like anonymous sharing links within 5 minutes. So what we're really seeing is this active exploitation against Microsoft environments. In many cases, they don't have MFA turned on, or not strong MFA. In many cases, the credentials were likely purchased from another place and then tried against that environment. So we have this really interesting kind of like two-path exploitations happening right now, where we have attackers that are actively going out to farm credentials through phishing, through vishing, using video, through text messages to be able to derive that initial credential, and then they're either using that or selling that for someone to then move into that environment and take that information. And really, you have to think about how these attackers approach things. The benefit to them is information. Like in many of these cases, we're not talking about ransomware. We're not talking about people who want to ransom you. They might strip a bunch of information out of your environment, but really what they're looking to do is drive into your environment, take as much out as possible, and then leverage it for more. Great example of this, one of the things we see really often, find an invoice that was sent recently to an external party, take that invoice back, put your account information into it, and then just send it out to whoever they sent that invoice previously. And at that point, that attacker now has the potential to make tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So as you're moving into the next kind of next couple months and you're thinking about how this is going, you're thinking about phishing, you're thinking about how all this fits together, it's important to think as well about how your users are authenticating. Do you have MFA enabled? Are there ways that people can authenticate from a single factor perspective? And how can you as an organization think about phishing? People will always get hit with phishing. What can you do to ensure that your users are safe? Because the more you can do to support them, the more they'll be able to act with more agency. And there's a lot, like every season we're going to have more of this. It's just kind of how it runs. But the ability to defend at the authentication side by enabling some of those configurations that are available within Microsoft 365 or Google, and really watching for those anomalies. If you use Blumira, if you use something else, watching for those anomalies that are strange, Knowing where your users are, if you don't have a policy on vacation time, build one. Build conditional access policies that solve that, and ensure that you have that baseline of security, and you will have a baseline stopping here. But it's always worth, of course, doing that step back, talking to your teams and saying, here's what's happening. Here's what's happening in the world. You're going to get texts, you're going to get emails, you're going to get phone calls. These things are not real unless they look like this. Here's how we can support each other as a group to do that double check for you. So as usual, let's work together to solve problems, because as we work together, we can always do better together.
Finally, fintech company Marquis is suing firewall provider SonicWall after a ransomware attack that they say traces directly back to SonicWall's own breach. If you missed it, SonicWall suffered a breach last year that exposed firewall configuration backups for its customers. Initially, they said fewer than 5% of their customers using the backup service were affected, and then they quietly revised that to everyone. Just everyone. Marquis alleges that the stolen configs included emergency passcodes that let attackers bypass the firewall and deploy ransomware, compromising data on over 400,000 people, including social security numbers and financial records. When your security vendor's breach becomes your breach, it raises some uncomfortable lawsuits. Matt, beyond the legal implications, what does this case tell us about managing vendor risk and supply chain trust?
All right, so let's talk about what actually happened here. The root cause was compromise in SonicWall's cloud storage of their configuration backup. So if you're not familiar with that, there's a button right in the UI to upload a copy of the firewall's configuration data to the cloud in the event you ever have to rebuild the firewall or make some configuration change, etc. This replaces what many of us used to do, which was download a copy of the config and store it in a folder on a file server. Now, those configuration backups have sensitive data in them. So think things like VPN passphrases for site-to-site, or maybe SSH keys or passwords, or if you're using a third-party identity provider, what many organizations call break glass accounts, right, for emergency access if the identity provider is down. Now, initially there were reports when this came out that not all companies were compromised, not all storage was compromised, and it later turned out that every configuration file was potentially accessed. So hearing that, my response, if I put on my practitioner hat, is even when the first news came out, I'm rotating all of those creds. Any account, any VPN key, anything, right? Anything potentially sensitive. And that might include things like wireless passphrases, if you're not doing some kind of certificate-based authentication, because you might have access from the parking lot, right? Kind of like the old war driving. It's a legitimate issue. So from that perspective, it's hard for me to. There's kind of two perspectives here, right? Yes, SonicWall likely was negligent, or it may come out that negligent, something happened that they got compromised, whether negligent or not. But two, that almost doesn't matter from the what do you have to do now perspective. The reality is that data is out there. And so from a security perspective, upon hearing that, I just rotate everything just because I felt like I had to. And yes, it would be painful to rotate things like my wireless passwords, but so be it. You kind of have to do that. It's not always pleasant. Then you may start thinking about, certificate-based auth for wireless devices. All that aside, the lawsuit itself, I'm not really sure what's going to happen here. If you made me pick something, I would say it's going to get settled, just because nobody really wants that precedent to get set, that it would be a long, drawn-out legal battle. But, it's one of those things that both are kind of an issue. Yes, the vendor had a problem, and also the network administrator had an issue, right? The organization, I don't want to blame the poor network admin, but the organization had an issue in that they didn't necessarily take a response that you could make a strong argument they should have taken in that stance. We'll see what happens with the lawsuit. Again, not a lawyer, but if I had to bet, I'd say it gets settled.
So, this week, a worm that turns unaware developers into unwitting distributors, the annual reminder that the IRS doesn't SMS, and the legal fallout when security infrastructure becomes an attack vector. As always, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Extra credit this week if your name is also Matt. Our deepest apologies to Joe Estevez. The film that he was in, that masterpiece, was Soul Taker, not Soul Sucker. Our deepest apologies for this error. We'll be back next week with more news you can use. And until then, stay safe out there. Bye-bye, everyone.